The village had never felt so silent. The fields, once vibrant with the sounds of children playing and the chatter of neighbors, now lay still, as if the earth itself mourned the heavy toll of the war. Elizabeth stood by her window, staring out at the overcast sky, her hands tightly clutching the curtain as she watched the world go by. Each passerby seemed to carry their own stories, their own lives, filled with movement and purpose. But Elizabeth felt detached from it all. Her world had come to a standstill. It had been 6 months since her husband, Thomas, was reported dead in battle. 6 months of waking up to an empty bed, of walking through the house that now felt like a hollow shell. The remnants of his life were everywhere, the worn leather of his boots by the door, the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the linen cupboard, the books he had never finished reading, and the quiet space next to her at the dining table. Everything about the house screamed his absence, and yet, she could not bear to part with any of it. It was all she had left of him. The early days after the news had come were a blur. Elizabeth had been surrounded by well-meaning relatives and friends, all offering their condolences, trying to comfort her in their own ways. But their words felt empty. There was no solace in the phrases they repeated. He gave his life for his country. At least he didn't suffer. You're so strong. He'd be proud of you. They didn't understand. They couldn't. How could anyone possibly understand the raw, jagged pain that now consumed her every waking moment? The ache of a heart that could never be whole again. As the days turned into weeks, Elizabeth became increasingly reclusive. She no longer attended the village gatherings, the weekly tea parties, or even the church services she had once enjoyed. She could no longer bear the thought of facing the world outside her door. It wasn't the pity that bothered her so much, though there were whispers, of course. It was the fear of being seen as a burden, as someone who could never quite fit in with the life that had gone on without her. It wasn't that the villagers weren't kind. They were, in their own way. But they didn't know how to talk to her, how to reach her. They couldn't possibly understand the depth of her grief, and she felt too fragile to allow them the chance to try. Every morning, she awoke to the same suffocating stillness. She dressed in the same dark clothes, as if her wardrobe had become a reflection of her soul, muted, somber, worn out. Her hands, once nimble and quick with the tasks of daily life, now trembled with the weight of simple chores. Cooking meals for one felt pointless. Even walking through the streets of the village became an agonizing reminder of what she had lost. Everywhere she turned, she saw couples, families, children, all things she would never have again. It was as if life had moved on without her, and she was frozen in time. But Elizabeth wasn't just grieving the loss of her husband. She was mourning the future she would never have. They had been planning so many things. A small cottage in the country, children they had always talked about, dreams of a simple, quiet life together. Thomas had been her anchor, the person who held her steady through life's storms. Without him, everything felt uncertain, as though the foundation of her world had crumbled beneath her. She didn't know who she was without him. How could she? For nearly a decade, they had been a unit, a pair. Now, she was a solitary figure in a world that felt too large, too loud, too indifferent. One evening, as the sun began to set and the light outside faded into twilight, Elizabeth stood by the window once more, staring at the horizon. The village had grown quieter with each passing day, but today, there was a slight stirring in the air. Someone had mentioned a meeting for widows at the community hall, an informal gathering where women like her could share their grief and find solace in one another's company. It was an invitation she had received several times, but each time, she had declined. She couldn't bear the thought of attending. The very idea of standing in front of others and talking about her pain seemed unbearable. What could she possibly say to them? What could they say to her? She feared the questions, the looks of sympathy, the awkwardness of trying to connect with people who couldn't understand her agony. But the invitation had lingered in her mind, like a soft whisper that refused to go away. It wasn't as though she had anything else to do. The days stretched out before her like an endless void, each one indistinguishable from the next. And so, as the darkness settled over the village, Elizabeth found herself standing at the edge of her decision. She could remain in the silence of her grief, hidden away from the world, or she could step into the unknown, into a room full of women who might, just might, understand her pain. The very thought of it terrified her. She imagined the room filled with women who were no different from her, all of them wearing the same veil of loss, all of them carrying the same burden. What would they see when they looked at her? A widow, yes, but also someone whose world had been shattered. She wasn't sure if she could bear to show that raw vulnerability to anyone, let alone a room full of strangers. But as the invitation sat in her hand, there was something else, something deeper, pulling at her. A quiet voice telling her that perhaps, just perhaps, this might be the one thing that could help her begin to heal. That night, she didn't sleep. She tossed and turned in her bed, the darkness pressing in on her. The sound of the wind rattling the windows, the soft creaking of the floorboards, everything seemed so loud in the quiet of the night. In the morning, Elizabeth dressed slowly, carefully, her movements mechanical. She hadn't decided what to wear, but somehow, she found herself putting on a simple black dress, the same one she had worn to Thomas's funeral. It felt fitting somehow. She looked at herself in the mirror, unsure of what she saw. Her face was pale, drawn, the shadows under her eyes deeper than they had ever been. She didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. Taking a deep breath, she left the house, the cool air brushing against her skin as she walked the familiar path toward the village hall. With each step, her heart pounded louder in her chest, a rhythmic beat that echoed her anxiety. The streets were emptier than usual, the shops closed, the village quiet as it always was now. She passed a few faces, but no one stopped to greet her. She didn't expect them to. She wasn't sure if she even wanted them to. Her feet carried her to the door of the hall, and there she paused, her hand resting on the cold doorknob, her breath caught in her throat. She could turn back. She could walk away and return to the safety of her grief, where no one could see her. But something stopped her. Perhaps it was the thought of the women inside, the thought that maybe, just maybe, they had felt this same crushing loneliness. And so, with one final glance behind her, Elizabeth pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was filled with a quiet hum of conversation, soft whispers of voices, but when she entered, the noise fell away. The women turned to look at her, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity, concern, and something else, something more profound that Elizabeth couldn't yet name. She hesitated on the threshold, her heart racing, unsure of what to do, unsure of whether she even belonged in this room of shared sorrow. But then, as if in unspoken understanding, the women slowly began to rise, one by one. No words were exchanged, but their eyes spoke volumes. They made their way toward her, and Elizabeth felt a hand gently take hers. She didn't know who it was, didn't need to. In that moment, she knew she wasn't alone. She wasn't an outsider. She was one of them. The weight of her grief, her fear of mockery, began to lift, just a little. And for the first time in months, Elizabeth allowed herself to breathe. She was not the only one suffering. In this room, there was no judgment. There was only the quiet, powerful bond of shared experience. Elizabeth didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. Elizabeth stood by the door of the community hall, the weight of her hesitation pressing heavily on her chest. She had come so far, but now that she was here, she was unsure whether she could actually walk inside. The invitation had felt like a distant promise, something theoretical and easy to ignore until it became an undeniable reality. The night was colder than she had expected, and the warmth of the hall beckoned to her, but the fear inside her was still as sharp as when she had first received the notice. She had imagined this moment countless times in the past week, the moment where she would either step forward or retreat back into the safety of her own isolation. And yet, now that she was here, it felt as though the choice was no longer hers to make. She had seen it in the eyes of her neighbors, in the hesitant glances and the gentle pity they tried to hide whenever they spoke to her. Elizabeth was a widow. She had become, in their eyes, a symbol of the cost of war, an archetype of grief and sorrow. But it wasn't the sympathy that bothered her, it was the subtle, unspoken judgment, the way people seemed to pity her, yes, but also feel a sense of discomfort in her presence, as though she were a reminder of something they didn't want to face. The past 6 months had been a battle between trying to hold on to some semblance of her old self and the overwhelming sense that her identity had been shattered beyond repair. In their eyes, Elizabeth was a widow, but in her own, she was still the woman who had been whole, who had once looked forward to a life of ordinary happiness. The grief she felt was not only for the man she had lost, but for the life she had once imagined. The invitation had come a few days ago, slipped under her door with the simple line, "A meeting for widows will be held at the village hall this Thursday evening, for those who wish to share their grief and support one another." She had read it over and over, as if the words might change, might suddenly offer her something more than just a simple gathering. At first, she had thought it was absurd. What could she possibly find in a room full of other women who had suffered the same loss? Would they be like the others, awkward and unsure, offering polite condolences that were little more than empty gestures? Would she be forced to recount the details of her loss, her pain, only to be met with uncomfortable silence or, worse yet, pity? But there had been something in the tone of the letter that made her pause. The suggestion that this gathering wasn't just about talking, it was about sharing, about understanding. It had reminded her of a part of herself she had pushed away, the desire to connect with others, to not feel so utterly alone in her grief. That was the part of her that had pushed her to step outside the small, safe cocoon she had built around herself. That part had urged her to leave the house that had become both her refuge and her prison. It wasn't that Elizabeth was naive enough to believe that all her pain would somehow be soothed by a group of strangers. But there was a quiet, hesitant hope in her heart that maybe, just maybe, there was some solace to be found in the shared experience of women who had walked this dark road before her. And so here she was, standing at the door. She could hear voices from within, the murmur of conversation and the occasional soft laughter. It was strange to think that there could be any lightness in this place, a room filled with women who had lost their husbands, their futures, and in many cases, their very sense of self. Elizabeth tried to steady her breath, to calm the thundering in her chest. The world outside seemed so much simpler, more distant, than the one that awaited her inside. But she had come this far, hadn't she? She couldn't just turn back. Not now. And yet, even as she reached for the doorknob, there was a knot in her stomach that refused to loosen. As the door creaked open, she was immediately struck by the contrast between the outside world and the room beyond. The warmth inside was almost overwhelming, a stark contrast to the crisp, biting cold of the night air. The room was modest, lit by the soft glow of a few hanging lamps, casting a golden hue over the wooden floor. At first, the voices seemed muffled, distant, but as the door opened wider, the sounds became clearer, a quiet, almost reverent hum of conversation. Elizabeth hesitated, lingering in the threshold, unsure of what to do next. The women inside, who had been engaged in their own hushed discussions, suddenly turned toward her. The first thing Elizabeth noticed was how calm the room seemed. There was no immediate rush of pity, no rushed movements to console her. Instead, there was a palpable sense of quiet attention, as if each woman in the room was waiting for her to make the first move, to decide how she wanted to be. It was nothing like what she had feared. No one stared at her with a look of pity, no one averted their gaze, no one whispered behind her back. The air was still but not uncomfortable. It felt safe, in a way she hadn't realized she needed. Slowly, one woman rose from her seat, her movements measured and graceful. Elizabeth watched her, unsure of what to expect. Was this some formal ritual, a greeting she wasn't prepared for? The woman approached her slowly, her face soft with empathy, her expression neither forced nor false. She didn't speak at first. Instead, she simply held out her hand, not as an offer of charity, but as a gesture of shared humanity. Elizabeth could feel her heart racing, but in the woman's eyes, she saw no judgment, no expectation. She wasn't being asked to prove anything, to apologize for her grief or to wear a smile of courage. This was simply an invitation to be. Elizabeth took the woman's hand, and in that brief moment, she was struck by the warmth and strength of the touch. It was the first time in months that she had felt something other than the hollow emptiness that had become her constant companion. The woman's grip was gentle, but firm, as if offering her the reassurance that, for now, she was not alone. The room seemed to hold its breath as Elizabeth stepped further into the hall, her shoes clicking softly on the wooden floor. She could feel the eyes of the other women on her, but there was no judgment in their gaze. They were watching her, yes, but it wasn't as an outsider. It was as if they were waiting for her to join them, to share the unspoken understanding that bound them together. Elizabeth found herself slowly moving further into the room, her feet moving of their own accord. There was no turning back now. A few more women rose, approaching her with the same quiet, measured steps. Some of them were older than her, their faces lined with the years of hardship and sorrow. Others were younger, their eyes still raw with the pain of fresh loss. But all of them shared the same thing. They understood. It wasn't that they had the answers. It wasn't that they could take away her pain. But they understood the silence that had settled over her, the weight of grief that felt too heavy to carry alone. The women began to surround her, each of them offering a gentle touch on her arm or her shoulder, their faces kind but not pitying. There were no grand speeches, no awkward introductions. There was only the unspoken recognition that they were all here for the same reason, because grief was a thing that could not be borne in solitude, because it was only in the presence of others who had walked this same dark path that the weight might feel just a little bit lighter. One by one, the women seated themselves again, their faces soft with the understanding of what Elizabeth was experiencing. And then, slowly, the chatter began again, but it was different this time. It was quieter, more intimate. The women didn't rush to fill the space with empty words. Instead, they allowed the silence to settle between them, giving Elizabeth the time she needed to adjust to the quiet comfort of their presence. As Elizabeth stood there, enveloped in the warmth of the room and the gentle understanding of the women around her, she realized something she hadn't allowed herself to consider in months. She wasn't just a widow. She wasn't just a symbol of grief. She was a part of something, a part of this room, this moment, this shared experience. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel something other than the cold weight of loss. There was, she realized, the beginning of something new. The room was alive with a quiet intensity, yet there was a profound stillness that settled over Elizabeth as she sat among the women. The initial shock of stepping into this space, with its soft lighting and its calm, deliberate warmth, began to fade. In its place, something else was taking root, a subtle shift within her, something she hadn't expected, a feeling of connection. The room, though filled with strangers, no longer felt alien to her. It felt like a place where her grief, her vulnerability, might find not only understanding but, for the first time in months, an opportunity to be shared. At first, no one spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, nor was it heavy. It felt like a natural part of the gathering, a quiet reverence for the shared weight they all carried. Elizabeth sat on the edge of a chair, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes casting about the room. She took in the women who surrounded her, some older, with gray hair neatly pinned into modest styles, their faces lined with the marks of years lived and endured, others younger, their eyes still red-rimmed from recent tears, their expressions raw and unguarded. They were all so different, yet in this moment, in the heart of this room, they were bound by something immeasurable, something that only they could understand. One woman, a widow who appeared to be in her mid-50s, spoke first, her voice steady but gentle. She had been the one to extend her hand to Elizabeth when she first entered, and now she began to speak, her words slow but deliberate. Her name, as Elizabeth soon learned, was Anne. She was the one who had written the letter inviting the women to meet. "It's strange, isn't it?" Anne began, her eyes scanning the room. "How one day you're living your life, planning for the future, believing in your dreams, and then one phone call, one knock on the door, and everything changes." Her voice cracked slightly, but she continued, her words coming from a place deeper than just sorrow. "It's like a part of you is ripped away, and the person you were before is gone forever." Elizabeth watched Anne as she spoke. There was no show of dramatics, no histrionics, just a woman speaking honestly about the unbearable weight she had carried, about the deep wound that had yet to heal, if it ever could. The room hung on Anne's every word, but it was the silence that followed that hit Elizabeth the hardest. It was a shared silence, one not filled with pity or sympathy, but with understanding. There was no need to speak because, in that moment, and had articulated what they were all feeling. They had all been the ones left behind. They had all lost something or someone that could never be replaced. When Anne finished, another woman spoke up. Her name was Margaret, and she was a few years younger than Elizabeth, her face still fresh with the traces of grief that hadn't yet faded into resignation. Margaret's eyes were bright, her expression intense as she leaned forward in her seat. "I think we all come here thinking we're the only ones who've been left behind," Margaret said, her voice quiet but firm. "We think no one else can possibly understand what we're going through." She paused, as though weighing her next words. "But the truth is, we're all the same. We're all just trying to figure out how to keep going, how to live with this, how to breathe when the air feels so heavy." Elizabeth felt her breath catch in her chest. How could Margaret possibly know what it felt like? How could anyone? And yet, she did. There was no question in Margaret's voice. She wasn't asking for confirmation, she wasn't wondering if they shared her pain. It was a simple, undeniable truth that hung in the air like a shared understanding. We are all in this together. And suddenly, Elizabeth felt less alone, less like an outsider. As the moments passed, more women began to speak, each one offering a piece of their story, a fragment of their experience. Some were quiet, speaking only in a few words, but each sentence seemed to carry the weight of years of loss. Others, like Margaret and Anne, spoke with more urgency, as though they were no longer afraid to say the words they had kept hidden for so long. Elizabeth listened, her heart swelling with each story shared. The stories were all different, yes, but the underlying theme was the same: love lost, lives changed, futures stolen. And then, as if on cue, the woman sitting next to Elizabeth leaned over and whispered, "It's all right to cry, you know." Her voice was gentle, but firm, as though she had said this many times before. Elizabeth turned to her, startled by the kindness in her voice. The woman's face was older than Elizabeth's, though she didn't appear much older in years. Her hair was silver, her eyes a soft blue that seemed to hold a depth of wisdom. She had an aura of quiet strength that was immediately comforting. "I know it feels like you have to keep it all in, like you have to be strong for everyone else. But you don't have to be strong here. Not now." Elizabeth swallowed, a lump rising in her throat. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding in until that very moment. How much she had been pretending to be fine, pretending to be whole, when every part of her ached with loss. She had been carrying it all, the grief, the loneliness, the shame, as though to do anything else would be a betrayal of Thomas's memory. But here, in this room with these women, it felt as though she could finally lay down her burdens, just for a while. The woman beside her smiled gently, then patted her hand. "You don't have to do it alone, you know," she said softly. "None of us do." Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment, letting the words settle deep into her chest. It was as though a veil had been lifted, and she could see clearly for the first time in months. For so long, she had thought that her grief was a private matter, something that only she could bear, something that would make others uncomfortable if she revealed it too openly. But now, here in this room, among these women, she saw that she wasn't the only one. She wasn't the only one who had lost. She wasn't the only one who had felt abandoned by life. She wasn't the only one trying to navigate a world that had suddenly become too large and too unfamiliar. As she sat there, listening to the stories unfold, Elizabeth's heart began to open in a way she had never thought possible. There were tears in her eyes, yes, but they were not tears of sorrow alone. They were tears of release, tears of recognition. These women were not strangers. They were her sisters in grief. And they had all come here to share in the burden, to hold each other's hands in the darkness. They were all just trying to figure out how to keep going. Elizabeth's breath steadied as she listened, her pulse slowing with each word. It was strange. This wasn't a moment of deep emotional catharsis, nor was it some sudden revelation. It was more like the slow, deliberate unfurling of something long buried within her, a part of herself that she had locked away for fear it would make her weak. But it wasn't weakness that she was feeling. It was something much more powerful, the realization that grief was not something to be carried alone, that it was not a burden that should be hidden away behind the walls of one's soul. It was something shared, something that could be borne together. The group fell into a quiet lull, as though everyone had said what they needed to say for the moment. There was no rush, no sense of urgency to fill the silence. The women simply sat together, their shared grief creating a kind of invisible bond between them. In that silence, Elizabeth felt something she hadn't in months: peace. Not because her pain had disappeared, not because she had found the answers she was looking for, but because, for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel so utterly isolated in her suffering. When she finally stood up to leave, Elizabeth's heart was heavy, but not with the same crushing weight that had borne down on her for so long. It was a different kind of heaviness now, one that was shared, one that was borne by all of them together. And as she stepped out of the room and into the night, Elizabeth didn't feel quite so alone. She knew she still had a long road ahead, but for the first time in months, she felt that she could walk it with others by her side. The burden of her grief had not disappeared, but the silence that had once surrounded it had been replaced by something stronger, a quiet understanding. And that, in itself, was enough to keep moving forward. As the evening continued, Elizabeth found herself feeling more at ease than she had anticipated. The initial nervousness that had gripped her at the threshold of the hall was now gone, replaced by a quiet sense of belonging that she had never imagined could exist. The women around her spoke freely, offering their stories of love and loss with such rawness and honesty that, for the first time since Thomas's death, Elizabeth found herself listening not as a passive observer, but as an active participant in something larger than herself. And the woman who had initially spoken had continued to share her experience, offering an account of her own journey through grief. Her words were simple yet profound, laced with the wisdom of time and experience. She spoke of the days that stretched out endlessly in the aftermath of her husband's death, the moments of quiet that seemed unbearable, and the gradual acceptance that had come with time. And spoke of the difficult decision to pick up the pieces of her life, not because she had been ready, but because she had come to understand that living, even in the midst of pain, was an act of defiance against the weight of loss. "We never forget," she had said softly, "but we learn to carry it, and one day, you realize that the weight isn't as heavy as it once was." Elizabeth's chest had tightened as she listened, feeling a stirring inside her. Could it be true? Could there really come a day when the weight of her grief might feel less suffocating, less overwhelming? Her heart was skeptical, unwilling to let go of the grief that had defined her existence for so long. But as the evening unfolded, Elizabeth began to see glimpses of something she hadn't allowed herself to entertain: the possibility that life might, indeed, find a way forward. Margaret, the younger woman who had spoken earlier, added her voice to the conversation, this time with a lighter tone. "I used to think grief was a straight line," she explained, her voice a mixture of humor and sorrow. "You know, you go through the stages, tick off each one, and then poof, you're healed. But it's more like a spiral, isn't it?" She laughed softly, shaking her head. "One day, you think you've made peace with it, and the next, you're right back in the middle of it all over again." The women around the room nodded in understanding, each of them having felt the roller coaster of emotions that grief so often brought. Elizabeth couldn't help but smile, despite herself. Margaret's perspective was both sobering and reassuring. There was no roadmap to recovery, no neat formula for healing. Grief was as unpredictable as the weather, shifting and changing with no warning. The fact that Margaret could laugh, even in the midst of her own pain, struck Elizabeth as a small, quiet triumph. Perhaps healing wasn't about erasing the pain. It was about finding a way to live with it, to coexist with it, without allowing it to consume every part of you. The women shared more stories, some filled with tears, others with laughter, but there was something remarkably grounding about it all. As each woman spoke, Elizabeth realized that they were not just sharing their pain, they were offering pieces of themselves, bits of their souls laid bare for others to hold. It wasn't just the act of speaking that was healing. It was the act of being heard. No one was rushed, no one was interrupted. Each woman had the space to express her grief in whatever form it took, and each one was given the time to do so. Elizabeth sat back in her chair, her arms crossed loosely over her chest, listening intently. She had spent months in isolation, hiding away from the world, convinced that her grief was something too heavy to share, too personal to burden anyone else with. And yet, here in this room, she was learning that grief, though deeply personal, was also universal. It was something that connected them all, something that bound them together in a way that words alone could not explain. As the conversation continued, Elizabeth found herself contemplating her own experience in a new light. She had come to this gathering expecting pity, expecting to feel like an outsider among women whose suffering was somehow different, more immediate. But that was not what she had found. What she had discovered instead was that these women did not view each other through the lens of their losses. They viewed one another as survivors, as women who had endured and were continuing to endure, even when the world around them seemed to have moved on. It struck Elizabeth with a quiet force, the realization that their stories were not just tales of sorrow. They were stories of resilience. Every woman in that room had, in her own way, found the strength to face another day, to navigate a world that no longer made sense, to rebuild a life from the shattered pieces of the one they had lost. And though that rebuilding was often slow, often painful, there was something beautiful about the way they had managed to survive, even thrive, in the aftermath of devastation. The evening was drawing to a close, but no one seemed eager to leave. The air had shifted, and a kind of sacredness had settled over the room. Elizabeth felt a deep sense of gratitude for the women around her, for the way they had welcomed her into this fragile space, for the way they had shown her that it was possible to live with grief, to walk alongside it rather than be consumed by it. And then, as if by unspoken agreement, the women began to stand. Some moved toward the door, while others lingered in quiet conversation, still sharing their stories, still holding space for one another. Elizabeth hesitated, unsure of what to do. She didn't want to leave. She wasn't ready to step back into the silence of her home, into the emptiness that awaited her there. But she knew that she couldn't stay forever. The world outside would still be waiting for her, and while the bonds formed in this room were undeniable, life would continue. She would have to return to the reality she had been avoiding for so long. Just as she began to rise from her chair, and approached her again. This time, Anne's smile was gentle but knowing, as though she had sensed Elizabeth's hesitation. "You don't have to rush off," she said softly. "You can stay as long as you need to. We're here for you." Boys. Elizabeth's throat tightened at the kindness in Anne's words. She had never imagined that such a simple statement could feel like such a lifeline. But it was. It was a lifeline, a reminder that she was not as alone as she had once believed. She could take her time. She didn't have to have all the answers. She didn't have to fix herself. She only needed to keep going one day at a time, and when she needed help, when the weight of her grief felt too much to bear, there would be women waiting for her, ready to listen, ready to hold her hand and offer comfort. Elizabeth nodded, a small but sincere smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, and squeezed her hand gently before turning to leave, but Elizabeth stayed for a few more moments, letting the peace of the evening settle around her. The room, which had once seemed foreign and intimidating, now felt like a sanctuary, a space where grief was not something to be feared or hidden away, but something to be acknowledged and shared. The darkness of her loss was still there, of course, but now it no longer felt like an insurmountable void. It felt like something she could live with, something she could carry, not alone, but with others who understood. Eventually, Elizabeth stood and made her way to the door. As she stepped out into the cool night air, the world felt just a little less overwhelming. The weight of her grief had not disappeared, but it no longer felt quite so suffocating. She had learned in this room that there was no shame in feeling broken, no weakness in seeking help, no guilt in allowing others to hold the pieces of her shattered heart. The stars above twinkled faintly, and as Elizabeth walked home, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in months: hope. It wasn't the kind of hope that promised to fix everything, to make everything okay again. But it was a quiet hope, the kind that whispered that maybe, just maybe, things could get better, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.